And okay, so the title of this talk is Environmental Justice in Indian Country and Moving Toward a Transformational Land Ethic. And it's this concept of a transformational land ethic that I'm working through in this new book that I'm working on. And we'll get to that toward the end. So how I give you just a quick little kind of overview of how I come to this work. And it happens as a result of my being a student, really. You know, as an undergrad and a graduate student, I went back to school later in life, and it's such a long story, and I don't want to diverge too much, but in my work as an undergrad student and a graduate student later, I was in Native American studies, and I had always, before I had come back to school, I considered myself an environmentalist, somebody who was really concerned about the earth and the land and the environment. And I had kind of an activist background too, and working in Native communities in the town, in the urban area where I was living in Northern California. And I really this is how I began writing as sort of a citizen journalist. And what we used to call in those days a grassroots journalism, working around a very contentious issue, which I write about in the book, on the chapter on the history of the environmental movement around Indian country, and how the environmental movement has this very difficult relationship with Indian country. But anyway, so I started there. That's what really ultimately drove me back into school, where I was able to bring all of these things that were important to me together. And I was taking courses in environmental justice, and I didn't really know exactly what that was. But what I discovered through two different classes was that the way that we talk about, or the way that scholars talk about environmental justice as a discourse and as a theory, there was very little literature about, addressing American Indians and what environmental justice means in precise terms for Native people. There's a lot of case studies, there's a lot of history, or a certain amount anyway at that point. But when you start really getting into the nitty-gritty of what environmental justice is, and the way it's practiced, is Indians are pretty much invisible from that discourse. And so it became my research agenda to address that, to fill that gap. And so I came up with this idea that it needed to be indigenized. And that's part of a decolonial approach. So like decolonizing environmental justice also means indigenizing it, meaning to make it responsive to Native people's concerns. And the way that it appeared to me, based on all I was learning about this field we call environmental justice, based on the history and how it starts, and where it comes from. And it starts in, the kind of a thumbnail sketch about the history of how environmental justice as a discourse starts is in the South. In your part of the country, actually, in North Carolina, in I think it's called Wade County. And it's in the early 1980s, and a toxic waste dump is planned for a poor Black community. And so the community organizes to stop this dump. And this leads to a series of studies. And the studies postulate that there's a pattern, and the pattern is that Black communities are being targeted for these toxic facilities because they're Black. And so that gives rise to this concept called environmental racism. They say that this is a kind of racism that has environmental expression or manifestation. And so it turns out, like, so all these, it leads to all these other studies, and now it becomes an academic discipline, and people are writing about it. And meanwhile, all this other activism is happening. So it really begins as activist movement, as part of the environmental movement. And what I discovered was that in all of that literature, what was not being addressed were Indigenous people's very different conditions. And those conditions really come down to the history of the US as a colonial state, a settler colonial state, that's built on invasion and genocide and land theft. Like, none of that's ever mentioned in the literature. It's got this very narrow focus on environmental racism that refers to the ways people of color are disproportionately affected to risk and harm of these environmental processes that have these negative impacts on their health. So this language of risk and harm and human health, that's pretty much like the scope of it. But for Native people start, our position as nations inside the state are different than being ethnic minorities. So this is a very important point. We have never been just ethnic minority communities. As nations with political relationships to the state, this changes the conversation. And with histories of treaties and of this very long history of corruption and the most horrible kinds of abuses, but also very different particular relationships to the land as people who have been on the land for thousands and thousands of years. So all of that stuff, none of that gets factored into the literature on environmental justice. And so I'm looking at it through the lens of a Native methodology or Native American studies methodology, and applying that lens as an organizing principle for talking about what environmental justice means for Native people. And so that's kind of the starting place. So I wrote this master's thesis, and while I was in grad school, and this ends up becoming the seed for this book. And I think it's chapter 5 in the book, or no, it's chapter 7 on the protection of sacred sites, is a distilled version of that research paper. And then so I adapted it and then built out the book from there to this much broader picture of what environmental justice looks like through the experience of Standing Rock. Because I had gone there, I was on the ground for just not very long, for just a couple of days, but I was there as a journalist covering the story. And so, I had this, a little bit of an inside perspective about that. And it was a perfect case study to look at, to theorize these issues more fully, because clearly it was an environmental justice issue, and all of these particularities are evident in that story. Okay. So I want to talk for a minute about what we mean by settler colonialism. If we're looking at this through the lens of settler colonialism, what does that mean? So defining our terms of engagement here. And this painting here is probably familiar to most, if not all of you. I think we've all seen this painting at some time in our lives. It's a very famous sort of Americana painting by John Gast in 1872 called American Progress. And in this image, we see it has everything that you want to know about settler colonialism is in this image. And the way that if you kind of train your eye on it, you see this central figure in here. Her name, by the way, is Columbia. And she's like evocative of an angel, right? She's got long flowing robes. She has all what appears almost to be wings, but they're not wings, they're just part of her flowing robes. And she's very angelic looking, and she's floating through the sky, and she's very fair skinned, of course. And she's got a book in her hand, and the book might, tempt you to think that it's a Bible, but it's not a Bible. It's a book of education. And on her arm, you see she's got a coil of wire, and that wire is stringing what we presume to be a telegraph. And she's traveling from east to west. And as she travels, she's bringing light with her. Light is trailing behind her, and she's heading into the darkness. In the light, we see all of this, this technology. We see railroads. In the distance, we see boats. We see a large bridge. We see farming technology. We see, a stagecoach with horses and intrepid pioneers in their stagecoaches. And then to the left, we see where it's dark, we see Indians and buffalo, and they are retreating into the darkness. And the message is clear that all the sort of implements of Western, this is about Western movement, westward expansion, and in the message is that the Enlightenment, we could say the Enlightenment of the European project is sweeping its way across the land, remaking the land in its own image as the people who have been on the land for thousands of years are retreating into the darkness, into, we presume, disappearance. So we can, the overtones here are religious, and they're unmistakable. How religion is tied up with this. And so in this narrative, Indigenous people are constructed as inferior. They are backwards, they're uncivilized, they are doomed to disappear because of their lack of civilization. And so this constructing of Indigenous people, this manifesting of destiny as we know it, is about the legitimizing of the taking of the land through religious doctrines that get woven into the legal system. This is a really important point. Religion is central to all of this. Christianity and Indigenous peoples is non-Christian people. So this gets woven into the legal structure, and it maintains this paternalistic and hegemonic relationship between the US and Native nations. That term hegemonic simply just means control. So if you think about paternalism and, it's all tied up with this idea of control and domination. And so in this, settler colonialism is fundamentally a genocidal process, because not only does it seek to displace Native people, it does it through a wide range of violences, including actual killing, but also cultural genocide. And part of this cultural genocide is the killing, is what we call epistemocide. It's the killing of knowledge systems. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But I'm going to put my headphones on first because I've got some noise in the background and it's distracting. So, okay. Now I'm going to switch the slides. Okay, can you hear me okay? Anybody?
Your volume is a little low.
Is it? Okay, let me, is this any better?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to use these illustrations here to talk about something, to talk about this westward expansion and the way that we've all been taught and conditioned to think about it. And in this conditioning is about the narratives that we've all been indoctrinated in our American education. Westward expansion, of course, is about the Industrial Revolution. This is about all the technology we see sweeping across the land. This is all tied up with European superiority, you know, technological innovation. And so this modernity, this modernity that's happening to the land, you know, through European Enlightenment, is these narratives of progress, and in these narratives of progress, as Europeans are flooding onto the continent and moving westward, colonizing the land. It's a process of life giving for and future building for those settler populations. But what it's doing to indigenous populations is that it's ultimately genocidal. So and part of the way that it's genocidal is the way that it's remaking the landscape through technology. And so it's about the way that it impacts ecosystems. By severely remaking them and really bringing death to those ecosystems in the same way, or a very parallel way, that it's bringing death to indigenous people. And so we can bring these two concepts together in this word called ecocide. So it's the killing of an ecosystem plus the genocide of people always goes hand in hand in these histories and these processes. And the way that it happens is in very, we can show it in very spatial, mapped ways. And in this image here on the left, you'll see this is an image of the Missouri River watershed. And this is the watershed that goes through the land of the Lakota people, the Great Sioux Nation. So all of this land was traditionally Lakota territory, Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people. All of this huge swath of land was originally set aside in the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851. And it was all of the lands that are now North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and probably beyond that. But it's the watershed of the Missouri River, and people lived there for, long time. And through the 20th century and the late 19th century, the United States, shrinks that territory through all kinds of corruption and graft. And eventually it turns into what you see now, these 7 small reservations that mark the boundaries of the 7 different bands of the Lakota people, the Sioux people. And Standing Rock is right here on the border of North and South Dakota. And so what happens is in 1944, Congress passes the Pick-Sloan Act, and the Pick-Sloan Act is about controlling the Missouri River because it's it's prone to flooding. It also needs to be harnessed to create bodies of water for irrigation for farming, because that's one of the things that's one of the main functions of dams. So the Pick-Sloan Act authorizes the building of 5 dams on this watershed, and so it creates these large bodies, these large reservoirs, and that flooding, that's the reservoirs, floods significant portions of places where Native people are living. So, we're talking village sites, we're talking towns, we're talking food sources and burials and medicine sources, things that constitute Native life. And so, as Nick Estes writes in his book, Our History is the Future, what the flooding through the creation of these dams did was it displaced over 900 Lakota families. We're talking thousands of people that this flooding displaces and severely disrupting their lives in this culturally genocidal way. And so the impacts are large scale through displacement, massive displacement of people and families. On the other hand, we have another watershed over here in this image. This is the Columbia River watershed. This is where my ancestry is, up here, right about in this area. This is the area of the Colville Reservation. It's the Northern Columbia Plateau, and the headwaters of the Columbia River are somewhere up here in British Columbia. But you see the river runs all the way through here and then out here to the mouth to the Pacific Ocean. And something completely different is happening on this river through colonization. And it's the remaking of the river through massive, extensive dam building. Whereas on the Missouri River, you only have 5 dams that cause all this disruption. On the Columbia River, you have the building, and not just the Columbia River, but its tributaries too. You have the building of over 60 dams that happen beginning around the same time period when the Pick-Sloan Act is passed in 1944. The first dam on the Columbia River, actually, I don't know if it's the first dam, but it's certainly in this time period. The largest dam in the U.S. gets built. It's called the Grand Coulee Dam, and it starts being built in 1936. It gets finished about 1940. It's considered this, wonder, this engineering marvel. It's the biggest dam in the world, and it's this, people are just, amazed by it. And that's on the Colville Reservation, and it gets built without the permission of Colville people. And it builds this big lake, Lake Roosevelt, and it displaces people, but that's not the biggest damage that it does. The building of this big giant dam, it causes the flooding of a major salmon fishery called the Kettle Falls, and that's the place. It's a very ancient ancestral place of food gathering. People who live along the Columbia River consider themselves salmon people. They're people of the salmon in the same way that the Lakota people in the plains are the people of the buffaloes. So it's this relationship of reciprocity with these people, these relatives, these beings that are considered relatives. And the same thing happens down here in the lower Columbia Plateau with the building of the Dalles Dam and later the Bonneville Dam. But the Dalles Dam leads to the flooding of another major salmon fishery called Celilo Falls. And Celilo Falls is about the same size as Kettle Falls, and it has the same impact. It's culturally genocidal because what happens is when you flood the falls, you block the ability of salmon to migrate upstream in the ways that they have been doing, since time immemorial, and that has led to the ecological calamity that we have now of the collapse of salmon populations. Salmon is considered a keystone species, and so when you see the collapse of a species like that, it leads to the collapse of other species, other life forms. And so this is a major, oh, that sound is really hurting my ear in my headphones. So we have this much different kind of problem, an ecological problem that is playing out in this very different way. Now, in this other image here on the right, we see an entirely different kind of ecological calamity playing out, and this is related to oops. This is related to uranium mining. So this here is the entire Western United States, basically. And this area that we call the Colorado Plateau. So here in this general vicinity, and here in the Four Corners, this is the Four Corners area of the Southwest where you see this concentration. These black dots all represent uranium mines, abandoned uranium mines. And so you see just the scope of how many of these uranium mines exist that are now abandoned. And in this area here, oh shoot, in this area here you see, and this is the Navajo Nation where this large black mass is. And then other tribal lands down here in New Mexico. But these uranium mines were part of the Manhattan Project. They typically were on the Navajo reservation and other adjacent Pueblo lands, and this decades of mining of uranium has led to and the abandoning of these mines once they were finished, which were never cleaned up, has led to this massive environmental problem where these are open pit mines where, and also tailing deposits that are open to the air. They are leaching into the groundwater, and in some cases, there are places where children play, and so it's, to this day, it is contributing to, elevated cancer rates, respiratory problems of Navajo people. And so it's this ongoing contamination that has, again, this genocidal impact. Okay, so so shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about something that I focus on in the book, which is the history of the environmental movement and its difficult relationship, its ambivalent relationship with the with Indian country, is the way I put it in the book. As the conservation movement, in American society, when we see this westward expansion happening, we see the urbanization in the East, and it's leading to environmental problems. It's leading to the closing of wilderness areas, and as Western expansion happens, also what's happening is the closing of the frontier. So California gets made a state in 1850. And this very highly romanticized period of American history is coming to an end. And so there's all this like anxiety about this, like angst, and that gets mixed in with this environmental angst that's building with the increasing pollution in these urbanized areas and the perceived disappearance of natural spaces due to urbanization. And so it gives birth to this new sensibility, this conservation and preservation movement. And so we see in 1872 the beginning of the protection of these quote unquote wilderness spaces. This is how it's framed, these wilderness spaces, and wilderness now needs to be protected. And of course, wilderness is about a very particular construction of the natural world, as places without people. But it's a very European construction, because nowhere on the continent was there any place that there weren't people. So this concept of wilderness without people was something that, as Mark David Spence says in his book, Dispossessing the Wilderness, he says these wilderness spaces first had to be created because they didn't really exist. So this is a social construction. It's the remaking of the land in these socially constructed ways, much like the way we conceive of race in this country. The land is conceived in these very socially constructed ways. And so all of that's bound up with with whiteness, and how America is conceived as a white country, and how these spaces are protected for the use of white people while other people are being marginalized, you know, black people, other people of color, and certainly Native people, because Native people are being moved off of these lands in order to create these parks, these national parks. So this is, you know, just a very broad overview of how white supremacy it really infiltrates the beginning of the environmental movement in this country through conservation and preservation eras. And, you know, we see, you know, John Muir here in this picture up here, you know, he sort of embodies this very dichotomous relationship with the land, as this, you know, revered figure in the movement. But, you know, he's also, as we now know, he's this very problematic figure because he's basically pretty white supremacist, and he's very much looks down on the Indians, especially there's history, you know, around Yosemite. He's, you know, advocates for the moving of indigenous people out of that that valley, and so he's got this very, you know, checkered kind of history behind him. So and so he's very kind of emblematic of this white supremacy that infiltrates the environmental movement. By the time we have what's called second wave environmentalism, through the night, which begins around the 1960s, we see this, you know, it's all bound up with, you know, I'm getting some distracting noises. I don't know if somebody's not muted, but it's really hurting my ear. So
I've muted everybody. I'm not sure what it is.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll just power through. So second wave environmentalism is connected to the back to the land movement, to the you know, the counterculture movement, and so this young youth movement, they start looking to Indian country in ways that people hadn't looked to Indian country before, because they're starting to see that these environmental problems, you know, they're escalating, and they are tired of the values of their parents. They don't like the conservatism of their parents' generation, and so they start going to the Indian reservations and emulating the way Native people live. That's why, you know, you see the hippies, you know, they grow their hair long and they start wearing leather and moccasins and fringe and beads and feathers. And they're really looking toward the Indian for answers, because they get that Native people have been on the land for a long time, and there's something, that there's knowledge there that you know, needs to be tapped into. And but what happens is that it becomes this weird fetishism, the fetishism of Native people, and that's tied up with the ongoing patterns of erasure that are already well established in the American social landscape. And so this pattern of cultural appropriation, we can connect. It's very convoluted, but we can connect it to this conversation of epistemocide, or the killing of Native knowledge, which I'm going to get into this next slide. So shifting gears again, you know, we come into this territory of indigenous knowledge, and how Native people actually have lived on the land and really in sustainable ways, which is what makes them indigenous. They're indigenous because they've been there for so long. They've learned how to live in very particular ecosystems, very particular environments, because they paid attention. They learned to live in cooperation with these systems. And so they, perceived, and their cultures emerged out of their relationships to these places, their cultures, their religions, and their knowledge systems. So, we call these epistemologies. So the word epistemology simply means the way you come to know the world, and so or the way that you understand knowledge. How knowledge is constructed. And so for Native people, it's always all about their relationships to land, in particular ecosystems. And so we say that because there's so many different kinds of ecosystems, there's not one monolithic indigenous knowledge system, because there is no one exactly the same ecosystem or environment. So it's always place-based. Indigenous knowledge is always place-based, and so Indigenous knowledge includes multiple kinds of knowledges based on these very particular epistemologies. And traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is one type of Indigenous knowledge. And so we say that TEK is not just theoretical, it's applied knowledge. So it's not just warm, fuzzy, mythology, Indigenous wisdom, and all these kind of soft terms that we use. It's actually applied knowledge. And I'm going to show you this quick little video that will give you a really good example of what we mean when we say TEK is applied knowledge.
This forest is about to go up in flames. Don't worry, it's intentional. We're here in Roslyn, Washington at a prescribed burn, and it's actually supposed to make the forest more resistant to fires, because these woods have been really unhealthy. Think of a prescribed burn as a vaccination against really, really bad fires. And just like giving out shots, you need people who know what they're doing.
This is like the main tool of prescribed fire. You get a little bit of a arm workout.
Oh, yes. Today, prescribed burning is showing up more and more in state forest management policies. Why? Because wildfires are way worse than they used to be. A century of poor forest management and fire suppression has created a lot of fuel to burn. All that underbrush acts like kindling. Climate change leads to hotter temperatures and longer dry periods, which create perfect conditions for a wildfire to start. Put all that together and you have the makings of a disaster. Today's wildfires can even take out big, old-growth trees that have historically been able to stand up to wildfire. Take this piece of ponderosa pine that's been around for over 2 centuries. This cross-section of a tree trunk is about to teach us a bunch of history, so show some respect and pay attention. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in the western US were already forest management experts. Many Native peoples embraced fire as part of certain ecosystems. In fact, many trees in the West, like ponderosa pines and giant sequoias, are made healthier by regular human-managed fire. The Yakama Nation used prescribed burning to keep the forests healthy and to cultivate different resources they depended on, like berry plants. But when colonists showed up, it didn't occur to them that the forests were so impressive and the timber so strong because they'd been taken care of by humans.
I mean, there were very colorful responses. In some instances, they're just burning things up. They would also notice these abundant berry fields, and they wouldn't always make the connection.
In 1910, there was a massive wildfire that spread across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. As a result, the federal government was like, we've got to take better care of these forests. Time for a Forest Service. Up until that point, there had been some debate over prescribed burning. But the new agency imposed a hard and fast fire suppression policy. No burning, no exceptions. Traditional burning was outlawed, and tribal members were punished for practicing it. And it turns out that was not the best way to keep forests healthy. It was also really culturally oppressive.
Preventing fires was another way of directly reducing native influence within their ancestral territories.
And forests that had been managed by humans for thousands of years were suddenly growing wild and unchecked. So that's basically how we end up here, in a period of time that's warmer than ever before in recorded history, with a whole lot of very unruly forests. Around the 1970s, some ecologists started to point out that suppressing fire in forests was actually making wildfire damage worse. And that way of thinking has gotten more and more traction.
2014, we had a record wildfire year. In 2015, we broke that record. I think people were, what are all the tools in the toolbox? How do we protect ourselves? How do we make our forests more healthy?
In 2017, the state of Washington made prescribed burns central to its 20-year fire management plan.
We obviously are inheriting a problem that's been over 50 years in the making. It's going to take us a while to get on top of it, but we are going to make a significant difference in restoring the health of our forests, and it will include prescribed fire.
Which brings us full circle, working with fire instead of suppressing it, a practice that's still alive in many tribal cultures today.
What we're really looking at is a group of people that have been able to survive for thousands of years based on their relationship, interaction, and management with resources. I don't feel like you're going to have a very efficient project in today's world ignoring a thousands-year-old data set.
It's a couple of years old now. I mean, they talked about, the extreme fires. And of course, since they made this video like 2 or 3 years ago, I was a consultant on this video. So I helped put that together. But since then, of course, we've had these, even bigger wildfires out here in California. So, that just punctuates how extreme the problem is. So what does it mean to decolonize environmental justice? Like, going back to that conversation, it means that environmental justice activism, theory, and law and policy, it must be able to recognize the ongoing structure of colonialism, of settler colonialism, because we say settler colonialism is not something that happened in the past. It's something that has embedded itself. It became a structure, and that structure always has this impulse to eliminate Native people in all these various ways, that the erasure of Native people. So it has to be able to acknowledge that history, because that history, it's different for Indian people than it is for all other people. So rolling us into that category of environmental racism is just not, it's far too narrow. It's also got to be able to recognize Indigenous people's very different relationship to the land, and their worldviews and their epistemologies, like this view of relationality, of seeing themselves as related to people, not just this extractive, exploitive relationship of land, like Western society has built itself by. So it also needs to, environmental justice needs to enact this in a very real way, this ethic of consent, of free, prior, and informed consent, which is enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that the UN passed in 2007. And that far surpasses what we have now in the legal system, which just advocates for consent. So in other words, development projects by law must consult with Native peoples when it involves their territorial land, but consult is a very slippery term, and it very often, in fact, the reason Standing Rock happened was because there was effectively no meaningful consultation, and that's why President Obama canceled the permit at the 11th hour in December of 2016. So consent, not consultation. And then environmental justice needs to recognize Indigenous knowledge and the role that Indigenous knowledge has to play, especially in policy planning and around all kinds of issues around environmental management, and especially around climate change. So finally, kind of leaning into this new work about a transformational land ethic, I'm looking at, what do we mean, this concept of land ethic? This is something that environmental philosophers talk about, environmental ethicists. It's a term, sort of a term of art in the environmental world. And a whole, pretty much an industry has risen around this guy named Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold was an original forester. He worked for the US Forest Service starting in the 1920s. He wrote a book called the Sand County Almanac, and in that book was this essay called The Land Ethic. And he became famous for it because in this essay, he theorized that, we have to go from, this exploitive, extractive, he didn't use the word extractive, but this relationship of humans to the land in this very utilitarian, exploitive way. And he said that we need to see ourselves as members of a biotic community. So kind of this seeing humans as part of the environment, not separate, which had been so embedded in the American system before that. And so he gets seen as, I guess, revolutionary, even though Native people had been living that way for thousands of years. But Aldo Leopold comes along, writes this essay, and now he's like a revolutionary. And Scott Momaday, on the other hand, is a Native, Native icon. He's a literary hero in Indian country. Some of you may know who he is. He wrote an essay that he called An American Land Ethic that was originally written in 1971. Now, he didn't even know who Aldo Leopold was, so he never even references Leopold's work. But he writes about a land ethic from a very particular American Indian perspective, and as a Kiowa person who was raised very traditionally. So I'm comparing the two works of these guys, but neither one of them, in their ideas of how humans should live ethically on the land, neither of them discuss what it means for humans to live ethically in relationships to each other. And so that's the intervention I'm trying to make, among others, in the new book. The new book is called Illegitimate Nation, Privilege, Race, and Accountability in the US Settler State. So sort of expanding, it moves out of the book on environmental justice to look at, what do we mean when we talk about land ethics, and what does it mean to be accountable? How does the US cultivate an ethic of accountability for its genocidal history and in existing structures? And bring justice for Native people so that we can all live legitimately on the land. That's where I'm going. And that's the end of my slides. And I'm going to stop the share and open it up to conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Dina. I was wondering how you might advise our new Secretary of the Interior, and where she's taken on a very big job, but I'm so glad that we have a Native American person in that role, and someone who likely understands everything you're talking about.
Yeah, I have a lot of confidence in her. I think that she is an excellent choice for that role, especially because the Department of the Interior houses the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so she'll have, pretty good influence for, not just land policy, but for, Native policy, one would presume. But she has been very clear about, her views about protecting land, and that's why she's under fire from the conservatives, because they think she's radical. To me, that's like a code term for she's Indian, right? So Indians are always like, the radicals, because they want to protect the land, and and oh, by the way, wasn't that all Indian land to begin with? And isn't there this unfinished business and this unaccounted for history? So I think that she brings all of that, on a subconscious level to this position. And I think it's really triggering for a lot of people, especially conservatives. But I think that, all of that said, I have every confidence in her. And I think her politics are in the right place, but at the same time, there has to be an acknowledgement of the fact that she's still working for the federal government. We have to be clear about who the boss is. And the boss is the settler colonial state. And so she doesn't get appointed there because she's Native. She gets appointed there because for other reasons, and she happens to be Native, and she has sane environmental policies, but the structure is still the structure, and what it does is it just creates a revolving door of people and personalities coming in and out of there, and we can't expect that she's going to be able to make any structural changes. I don't think. I think that she might. I think the most that we can hope for is some good land policy, some good progressive land policy, and and that'll be really helpful. But I think we're also going to see a lot of unleashed anti-Indianism, and there's an article. Or not unleashed, but I'm in a new round of anti-Indianism. And there was an article in the HuffPost this week about the uptick in violence of white nationalist militia violence on public lands, like the Clive and Bundy, like the Bundy Bunch, those kind of people, these nationalist, patriot groups that are all about privatizing public lands. And so there's been a growing, steady violence on those lands around those issues. And so there's expected to be, a growing, a continued trend in that direction, especially with liberals at the helm. So this kind of backlash.
Anybody else? Okay, Charles?
Hi, Dina. My name is Charles. It's nice to meet you. Thank you so much. So I am an historian. I come from Oakland, California, lived in Ashland and Eugene, traveled a lot around the West, and know a lot of the places, know a lot of these maps really well. I was fascinated years ago, and I adopted the Klamath. And what I have done is to study the heck out of the Klamath from its headwaters all the way down to the ocean, and a lot of the issues that are involved and stuff, and learned a lot. And there's fascinating stuff which is about kind of the modernity of what we've got, and to look at the movement of the salmon and how that all happens and then the lives that are involved. As time went by, I began to say, there must be other ways to draw a map of this place other than one that has a superhighway over the top of it. And so I began to look back in the Yurok and began to look at maps that had been drawn, ethnographers who had drawn maps in the late 19th century and began to try to develop another view. That then took me into kind of fantasy, and it took me to the maps that we've got to try to build over the top of that, and reading the accounts of people who visited. And at one point I found a really incredible book by a so-called princess of the Yurok talking about the old ways. And at one point she says, I am telling these things to you because there is nobody left to learn them. And how hard that is to read that. The question that I've got is, I don't find people's voices today that are talking about the ways of being with the world. I really like your idea of a relationality and the idea of how you're tied in with a place. Now, we have a principle that we use, which is one of the interdependent web and our place in that. What I'm looking for is voices today that are not going to be the academic world that you come from maybe quite so much. I'm not so interested in Leopold and an ethic. I'm more interested in people who kind of explore the world and the way it is and who celebrate that and talk about it. Is there a vibrant literature of that? Are there folks who are writing of their joy of being with the world, rediscovering that, revoicing that, experiencing that, and sharing it? Thank you.
I'm sure there is, but I'm not a literature person. Like, that's not my world. I'm not, I'm sure, in fact, I know there is a whole literature written by native authors that like fiction, and probably creative nonfiction too, that you can find. And trying to think of some titles. I'm not a big reader of fiction, so I'm really pretty immersed in the nonfiction literature stuff. Like, I'm about policy and law and the environmental, like that kind of hardcore stuff. So
taking down the dams on the Klamath is an incredible world of water law, but also on who gets what. Just an amazing world.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. What you said about the woman, that Yurok woman who said there's nobody left, and I imagine probably around the turn of the century, was probably maybe late 19th century was about when she said that. And from her perspective, I'm sure it seemed that way because the native California population was collapsing at that time. And it reaches its nadir around the turn of the century to, California goes from being a population of somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people to between 10 and 20,000 people. So there's this almost near collapse. So I can see why it would appear to somebody at that time that, we're all going to be gone in a few years at the rate we're going. But then what happens is that there's this resurgence throughout the 20th century, and native people come back. And now you see in the Klamath River Basin, the Yuroks and the Karuks are doing some of the most important work around environmental regeneration. In that film that you saw, they quoted a guy named Frank Lake. He's on the phone and he's talking about fire. He's Yurok, he's Karuk, so he's from that area. So he's one of several experts in cultural burning. That he works with the U.S. Forest Service. He's highly published. So this incredible wealth of knowledge is coming out of that region. I work kind of more and more. In fact, tomorrow night I'm giving a talk to Humboldt State, a group at Humboldt State University. Then going to give this same talk, but I'm working kind of more and more with folks from that region. And there's another book, and this is not what you asked for, but you brought up the subject of the Klamath region. This is a scholarly book by a woman named Kari Norgard, and the name of the book is Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People. And it's about the Columbia River, the Klamath River, and the work that she's done over years with the Karuk people in their environmental adaptation plans and policy stuff. So it's beautiful. It's a beautiful story. Hearing you say, recount that history of this poor woman who, this is how the world appears to her at this time, to where we're at now with her people being some of the leaders in Indigenous knowledge resurgence. Just to put those juxtapositioned perspectives together, and that this gives us cause for optimism.
may I follow up and ask, so what's the place that I can play in all of that? It doesn't seem like there's a place for me to have a voice in that world, to appreciate it, to respect it, to enjoy it. But what is our role on the periphery? Or is it to learn from that and take it back to our own relationality?
I think that's what it is. This, to think about what does it mean, to build a relational ethic and an ethic of accountability for people who are settler people, like people that are settlers who are benefiting from this horrendous history of genocide. What does it mean to be accountable to that history, even though it wasn't you that killed anybody, you didn't, cause any harm, but yet you live in a system that benefits from it, and that the structure that is built on that. How do you, and I think that this comes down to how you imagine it for yourself. What are ways that you can plug into Indigenous environmental movements, support Native people on the ground? The fights are everywhere. They're everywhere. And they're not just Native fights anymore. They're everybody's fights, because now all of our existence is threatened. If you believe climate change is real, and you are watching all around and you see, the environmental degradation that's happening, and you believe that there's a 6th mass extinction event in progress. I think that it's really all a matter of your own imagination about how you choose to enact or imagine, this kind of ethic and work side by side with Native people. I don't have the magic bullet, but I do have a way of thinking about it that hopefully, inspires and, and triggers your own ability to think about it.
So I will say that, I think there are many ways we can engage with Indigenous people. And I'm just going to put a plug in for next month. We're going to have a local Indigenous person join us to talk particularly about the environmental issues here in Florida that they're facing. And so this might be a way that we could conceivably make a difference here locally. Because I think as I'm listening to you, I mean, there are many, many issues everywhere, but it is the work that is around us immediately that we can engage with the local peoples with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I totally agree with that. What's that old axiom? Think globally, act locally, right? I think that applies here. And I am so encouraged to hear that you have somebody that's a local Native person coming to talk to you, and that you can develop a relationship with, and that would be a great person to ask that question of, how can we be of service?
Mm-hmm. Chris, you have your mute off. I assume that's what the question.
I mean, I just want to say, we started this whole thing off with Houston Cypress and from the Miccosukee, and talking about the issues of the water in the Everglades, restoring the flow, but not building huge raised roads, and saving the Cape Sparrow is some of the smaller local things that, since he told us about, I've been trying to be active with and help. But yes, our issues are water for the reservation lands in the Everglades. Mm-hmm. But I guess my question for you, Dina, and I have a million, but I know I can only ask one. So this is the most important one. Our congregation is thinking of developing a curriculum for our children and youth around Indigenous history and Indigenous forward, Indigenous now, and forward. How can we not mess up as white people? How can we not fetishize? Because, you know, whenever you do anything for youth, you're simplifying, and it so easily can come into appropriation. And yeah, do you have any, we know, you know, we're youth, so we know how to do it right. We'll buy the real books, we'll buy the real resources from our American Indian neighbors. But also, how can we work with our youth on this in a way that is just raising this awareness, particularly, of course, about the land appropriation. And, you know, we are living on stolen land that was built by stolen labor.
Yeah. I would recommend, I'm not an educator of young children, so I can't speak with expertise about that, but I can tell you that there is a great website called American Indian Children's Literature. And it's the source for really good books. It's run by a couple of Native women who are experts at this. And so, you know, that's a good place to start. There was a book that came out recently that's won some pretty prestigious awards called We Are Water Protectors. It's a picture book for kids, and it's beautiful. And I haven't read it yet. I haven't seen it, but it's a beautiful book that, you know, discusses the issue of protecting, you know, environmental protection, and, you know, through an Indigenous kind of lens. So I think those are good places to start. And, you know, I don't know, maybe, you know, I would also ask your Miccosukee friend that's going to talk to you next week and see what they have to say. You know, just reach out and ask for that kind of help from the local community.
Yeah. And if other people have questions, go on, but I'm really interested in something in one of your last chapters where you say that environmental justice may be served by creating nature at a personhood for nature, just like corporations are now, you know, considered people legally, and that we can consider nature personhood. And if there has been, since you published this, additional, you know, cases that have used nature being represented by lawyers.
Yeah, those are called rights of nature laws. And there are a few examples in the world where those have been used, where various kinds of natural like places like rivers and mountains have been given protection as people. Ecuador is one place, New Zealand is another place, India is another place. It certainly didn't solve all the problems. I do know that. There was one that happened just last week in Canada. So Canada becomes a new example of a river that gets the rights of nature, gets protected through this sort of novel legal regime. There's an organization called, in fact, I'm starting to work with them, and I write about that in the book. They're called the CELDEF, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF. And they're the primary organization doing this kind of education. So they work with educating communities. That might be something for you guys to plug into. they're working on kind of decolonizing. They're pretty settler oriented. They know that they need work around that. They need to include more Indigenous perspectives and be more responsive to the history of US as the colonial state, which is why they want to work with me. Unfortunately, you know, hopefully it'll work out. But that's an organization to watch.
Mhm.
I think that it's only one option. I don't think it's the only one. I don't even think it's the best one. I think it's a novel approach, but I think it's just one tool in the toolbox.
Okay. Yeah, I was wanting you just to add some other kind of political pressure. We're all big writers to our Congress people and to, you know, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, or whatever. We're people who write people. So we know that you say that the EPA needs to update and strengthen its definition of environmental justice, and that Executive Order 12898 and the 13175, which is the consulting and coordination, you know, still need to be strengthened. Where would we find out, you know, kind of what we would be saying to when we write the EPA about this?
Yeah, that's a big question. I would say, you know, right off the bat that, you know, for them to really take seriously the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its commitments to free, prior, and informed consent.
Yeah.
Like if they did nothing else, that if they actually could, you know, incorporate into their definition of environmental justice. Because right now, the way that definition is written is it says something like, you know, fair treatment without regard to national origin, like, you know, race, ethnicity, and national origin. And that right there is a real problem for Native people, right? For Native people as nations with government to government relationships with the federal government, to not acknowledge the nationhood of Native people is in direct contradiction to that statement. So that's a cause of harm.
Yeah.
So, you know, you could point that out, you know. But so those two things alone, I mean, we're talking,
right,
you know,
and that would prevent, you know, that could have prevented Standing Rock. So you'd think this would be a logical amendment to that executive order, or a new executive order.
Well, that's if you presume that the federal government has actually got some kind of benevolent, you know, underpinning and ethic of justice, which personally I don't think so. But you know, things happen only when you press for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, since when do we say, no, that can't be done, right? We don't do
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Native people have survived because they resisted, right? We say our existence is our resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, but you can't make something happen if you can't see it, right? If you can't conceive of it.
Right.
So no matter how far-fetched it might seem to rewrite the federal government's definition of environmental justice, like it's still something to envision.
Right. Right.
Well, Dina, it has been a pleasure. We have come to the end of our time, and I want to say, you know, everybody wants to thank you for being here. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for spending some time opening your eyes to some of the issues the Indigenous people are facing. And I bid you all good night.